And the first thing we need to do is create some more variations on that rock object that we had created in the previous chapter. I'm going to change this to the texture preview. And now what we can do is create some lower poly, even more lower poly objects, just in a couple of different layers. And that way we can still use the same object. So I'm going to pretty much do what I did before, but I'm going to remove our segment, hit the spacebar, Shift D to metaform, and then I want to jitter this a very small amount. So I'm going to use 0.01, and actually I might decrease that. Go back to jitter 0.005. We just want to jitter at a very small amount, and then I can hit Shift T to triple that, and now we have a little bit of a smaller object. And I'll go back in and create something a little more complex, where I'll go ahead and create the same sort of object, metaform it, and then we can jitter. And then I'm going to metaform this one again and jitter, and then Shift T to triple it. And now if I use Shift:, this is going to open up the magnet tool, and I can right mouse click within our back view, and I'm just going to pull this out a little bit to create some variations. Switch to our other view and our right view, and first click in basically the gray area off all of our buttons to reset the size, and then I can right mouse click in our right view, right mouse click in the center to move around what we've created, and just kind of add some more variations with some areas poking out. I'll click in that gray area again, and then we can do the same thing to our top view. So now we have a couple of different debris objects that we can use. And now I need to scale down these objects a little bit more, because these are going to be debris that will be coming off of the larger object. So I'm going to scale down this very low poly one. Shift H for the size tool, and just really bring that down. And then I'm also going to hit the spacebar to clear out the tool. Select all of our polygons, Control C to copy, go into a new layer and paste, and then I just want to make a few modifications to this to make it look a little different. I'll rotate it around, go back and use our magnet tool, and make some modifications to its shape, because the more variations that we have of objects, the better the overall scene is going to look. And now we can take a look at all of our different objects. And now I want to position these with size. So largest first, and then descending. So I'm going to take our third layer and go ahead and cut that and paste it into a later layer. And I can take our second, cut and paste that into our third layer, and then go back to that second layer, or the third layer that we had before, cut it, and paste it into our second layer. So now we have some new objects in the scene. We can also see there are some polygons that are sticking out a little bit too far. So I'm going to change this to our wireframe shade, and Control T to use the drag tool, and just pull in that point and any points that are sticking out a little too far. Because we want to increase the realism and not decrease it. And our low poly ones we really don't need to worry about too much. And now let's take a look at our different sizes. You can see we have some very small objects, some medium ones, and basically we're going to create a couple of different dynamic effects where we're going to have these objects coming out of the other ones and sort of breaking it apart. And that way we can get some really neat looking effects. So I'll go ahead and save this. And now we're going to start working on our dynamics within layout, and then we can load in these objects and start working on our explosion. So I'm going to switch to layout, and I'm going to add in, under our dynamics tab, a particle emitter, which I'm going to set to HV emitter, and I'm going to call this emitter underscore main, and click OK. And I would need to take a look at our scale in relation to our objects. So I'm going to close out our properties. We're going to go back into Modeler, and we need to take a look at the size of our largest object. And it looks like our largest object is around 200 millimeters. So we'll switch back to layout, and now we need to keep that in mind while we're working on this specific item. So I am going to use the left bracket key to decrease the grid size. And now I'm going to open up the object properties for this emitter, go to the effects emitter, and change our generator size to something a bit smaller. We're going to bring it down to 0.5. And now we need to think about how many particles we want to have, or how many initial larger objects we want to have in our scene. And I think I want to start out with 15, which would be a really good size. And then, even though the scene is going to be extremely complex by the time we're done, there's going to be a lot of objects, lots of polygons being thrown around. It's going to look really good. So I'm going to take our particle limit and set that to 15. So it's only going to create 15 particles. And each one of these particles, of course, with the effects linker, is going to be that first larger object that we had created. I am going to create a new group, and I'm going to call this group main, and click OK. And now our birth rate is 100, so our 15 particles are being created very quickly. But I really want all of these objects to be showing up at once, so I'm going to change this to frame so that all 15 particles show up immediately. And with our 200 millimeter size per grid right now, basically the size of our object will be one of these grids. So that will fit together, and they'll all be kind of clustered together, so when they break apart, it'll look really interesting. And now what we need to do is create a little bit of motion. And we want to expand these particles outward. But first I want to take a look at our animation length and how long we want the animation to be. Well, I think in this case I'm going to do 300 frames, which seems typical throughout the tutorial. 300 frames is something I work with quite frequently, so I tend to use it quite a bit for stuff like this. And I want to change our lifetime to 300 frames as well. And this is just a very good length for a very quick animation, and if we need to, we can always expand upon that a little bit further. The motion for these particles I'm going to create within the emitter itself and not use any global settings for gravity by using gravity objects or wind objects, because I want to do pretty much everything within the emitter itself. And I first want to set our explosion, which I'm going to set to 2 to begin with. And now we can take a look and see how far these objects will be extending. And I also want to remove our resistance. Bring that down to 0, because I do want something that will be consistent. And I'll go ahead and zoom out. You can just take a look. And that might be going out a little too far, so I will go back to our motion and decrease our explosion down to 1. And now we can take a look and just see how far this is going to expand. And we're just adjusting I'll bring this to 0.5. And 0.5 looks like it should be good. So next I want to add a little bit of gravity. We'll try -1 on the Y, which might be a little bit too much, but we'll have to take a look and see. And that's definitely going to be way too much for this sort of a scene, because this is going to be something that's kind of a space-type explosion. But we do want to have the object kind of falling down a little, because maybe it's closer to a larger object in space. But we don't want the gravity to be that high, and especially because this is a very short animation. So I'll decrease this to -0.1, and we can take a look, and I just want a very small amount of motion. And it still looks like it's a little bit too much, so we'll try 0.05. And we can take a look at that. And I'll go ahead and reduce that to 3. We'll do 0.03. Because we are working with something that's really not real-world scale. Typically with a scene like this, I don't have anything else within the scene that's to scale, but we can change our objects to make them larger, and then these settings will not influence the object as much as they currently are. But this looks good right here in -0.03. So we basically have the first motion set up for our first object. I'm going to go ahead and calculate this so we can save it. I'm going to go to the File, and now I can save our motion. And the reason I want to do this is because I am not planning on making any changes to this motion afterwards. And I do want to save out our calculated file so that we can render this on a network and not have to worry about each individual system calculating. And technically it won't. It's going to look different, and you want to make sure that your motion is saved out. So I'll save our motion, and then we can take a look at our emitter and what happens when we have a saved motion. And once our motion is saved, we can see the path of our motion and where it is saved, and it automatically loads that in. Now if we take a look at the other tabs, we can see that everything is grayed out, except under rotation, where we can change those different settings. But other than that, everything is completely saved out, and these particles will not be changing. We will no longer need to calculate this particle effect, because each one of these points is now saved in a file, which means we can also access that on the network. So now that we have that first animation set up, we can start taking a look at creating the objects and bringing them in, and also applying their effects first before we go ahead and modify this. So we are going to switch to Modeler, send our object into Layout, and we can see that our texture we had added to our object is still on our rock, although our other objects may not have that same surface. So I do want to go back to Modeler and just make sure that each one of these objects has that rock surface, and by hitting Q on each layer, it will show the active surface, which is currently the default, so we can tell that all of our objects have that rock surface on it. Now what I need to do before I go ahead and link this, because once we link it, all of our copies will be made, and then if we want to really make a complex effect, what we'll have to do is apply that effect to every single object. So first I want to create kind of a mock animation with this object, and we can simulate the effect, and then before we link it, we have all of our settings made and applied to that object, and then it'll be much easier to go ahead and use the effects linker and not have to worry about doing it over. I also made sure I saved out the scene at this point, and you'll want to save before you make any major changes, especially with the effects linker, because going through and deleting all of those objects, especially if you're working with thousands and thousands of objects, can be kind of difficult. So we want to make sure that we save our scene where we're at right now, and we can save copies in a sequence if needed, 001, 002, or an A and a B with 001 or 2 afterwards. And that way we can keep track of where we're at within each scene. But basically right now, we don't really have a whole lot of motion, and if I needed to, I could just remove this object. But what I want to do now is just create motion that's going to follow along with one of these particles, so we can get an idea of how to set this object up. And then once we have this one object set up with all the dynamics added, and even using the effects linker with a lot of it, then we can copy and save those motions, not baking them, but just the settings themselves, and apply them to all the other objects. So I'm going to take this first layer that we're going to have, which is the largest object, and move our pivot position to match up approximately with one of our particles. Scrub to the end of our animation, and we need to find that particle in order to make it link up. And we can see that has really moved down, so I'm going to zoom out a lot more. Take a look at that particle coming down, go to our last frame, and now we can move this rock to match up with it. And right now, actually, our particles are disappearing in our last frame. So we may need to change the start to a different time, but I'll stick with frame 300 right now, move this down, and if I go and select our emitter main, open up the object properties, we can take a look at file, and we can change our playback speed. We can also set this up to a lot of different options, parent particles, and this way have saved motions for that. But basically right now, I'm not going to be able to modify this too much, so I'm going to pretty much just keep it where I'm at. We want to go back and take a look at where that particle is ending, and it might just be easier to create a keyframe at 299 instead of 300. We could always end up rendering frame 0 as frame 1 and then not have to worry about that. So I'm going to delete the key at 300, move it to 299, and we can watch that particle also change just our lifetime to 299 for our total animation, and go ahead and just position this rock object to be inside of that particle. We'll need to move this over. And the motion's about the same on all of our particles, so we don't need to worry about the effect changing too much. And I'm going to move to around the center of the animation and just pull up the object to match with the curve. And if we need to go into the graph editor and modify that curve, we can just go to graph editor, and we're going to select our rotation on the Y, or actually our position on the Y, select our first point, and we want to change the curve to a visor, and it'll automatically fix that curve. And now we can see that coming out correctly. And now I'm going to save out a new version of this scene that we can start to work with. And we'll be coming back to the version we had before we started editing this to apply all of our different effects, because really this is just setting up the scene and figuring out what settings we need to use before we go ahead and copy all of these objects over, because it will be a lot easier to create these 15 objects if they already have all of their settings applied to them. So now we want to take this object, open up Object Properties, and under the Dynamics tab, we're going to add in Emitter, because we now want this object to become an emitter. And I'm going to reduce our generator size, which isn't really going to affect the actual size of the generator because it's directly related to our object's surface, but mainly it'll reduce this box we have on the outside that is a little large. So I'll go ahead and decrease these values down to 0.2. Cancel creating that keyframe, and now we can see that showing up. Now we also need to keep in mind that we're probably going to have these spinning and rolling, so I will need to change our keyframe. I'm going to go to our frame 299 and go to rotation and just add a bit of bank and also adjust our heading a little. Now that's going to throw off our rotation in earlier frames, or it may not. I'll go to that frame, delete key, and select rotation, and only have that delete our rotation keyframes. So now we won't have to worry about that effect at all, and just the position is set for that keyframe. Go ahead and rotate that a little bit more. And now we have a nice bit of rotation showing up on that object, and we need to adjust our emitter so that it's producing enough particles and in a long enough time. So we'll go to Particle, change our lifetime to 300 frames, and then our particle limit I'm going to increase. And now we're definitely not going to have this many particles being created because now we're going to be working with the second object, which is slightly smaller, but not nearly as small as our very small debris objects that we had created in layers 3 and 4. So our layer 2 object, we don't want to have too many of these coming off. So I'm going to decrease our birth rate down to 5. And we can see that it is something that looks a little bit better. And since this will be its own emitter, what I can do is use the explosion option and just add in 0.2 for explosion, and I'm going to add 0.5 for vibration. And now we can see that might be a little bit too much. So I'm going to remove our explosion first, reduce our vibration down to 0.2, and just take a look and figure out what is causing that overall effect. And since we're going to have rolling objects and spinning objects, we need to remember too that our explosion will cause them to sort of jet out in strange directions. And really the best way to create that rolling object is to use mainly vibration. So I am just going to stick with vibration and not worry about explosion, unless of course we didn't have an object that was spinning. So now we can see that trailing debris. I'm going to want to have a little bit of velocity with there and reduce the resistance. So I'm going to take our particle resistance, which is currently set to 1, and bring that down to 0.4. And we can take a look, because we do want these particles to continue and move out as the animation is going. We don't want them to stay exactly in the same place. We can also see how it is spreading out a lot further. But overall that looks pretty good. And of course the rotation and spin will be entirely controlled by the effects linker, so we don't need to worry about that too much. We just want to look at how many objects are in the scene and how many particles, and then we can go from there. And now what we can also do, once we get later into the animation, is use these particles not only to link to our other objects, but also apply an HV emitter and hypervoxels to it. And that way we can have sort of dust and other debris caused by hypervoxels to make it look even more realistic. So now that this is set up, what I want to do is calculate, and we can take a look at the motion a little more accurately. And it looks like I will need to reduce our resistance a little bit more, so I'm going to bring that down to 0.2 and calculate. And we have that spreading out quite a bit, so I'll go into our motion and reduce our vibration a little. And I can hit calculate again. And that looks like something that is definitely workable, where we still have a good amount of motion and it doesn't look like the particles are stopping at all, which is definitely something we want. So now I want to save a version of this out, and at this point we are no longer going to be using objects to generate our particles, and we're going to be using existing particles to attach emitters, and that's because we're getting very small with the size of our objects, and we're also increasing that amount a very large degree. And what will end up happening is we will need to save out and calculate particles for every single object we create. And basically, if we have these 52 particles connected to objects, then the other 15 objects for the main will also have another 52 particles or so, and then each one of those are going to need to be calculated. So really we don't want to create dynamics in that way, because it would just take far too long in order to save all of those files out and have all those connections. And really, since we're getting really small with these items, we won't need that sort of an effect. So go ahead and save this out, and then we can start going from there.